So I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Wadamanagal people of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. Since the dream time, we pay our respects to elders past, present, and future, and I also invite everyone to reflect on and acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands upon which you may be finding yourselves in the Zoom space.
So Tom, it's very nice to be here. Very delighted to talk about this fantastic book. I can say I've read the entire thing cover to cover, so I can say without any reservations that it is fantastic. It is easy to read despite being incredibly in-depth in its interventions, and it communicates with a shockingly high number of fields. I also can say without any exaggeration that this is the most highlighted anthropological Japanese book I've ever read. I rarely find this much that, as a linguist, is just fascinating. But I've also had the privilege of knowing you and knowing about your research for almost a decade now, if not a little bit more. So I did see that the project that ran into this book started in quite a number of different spaces. Indeed, at one point you were even, you may be ashamed for me to let everyone know, in linguistics.
Yes.
So can we just start by telling what was the initial seed that got you to study gay men in Japan and Shinjuku Nichome especially, and how did that sort of develop into the kind of research that eventually did become this book?
I think that there's both a personal journey and an academic journey, as there often is. And the personal journey really is my own engagement and discovery of the popular culture of Japan and also the queer popular culture of Japan when I was a young, kind of confused adolescent trying to grapple with my own sexuality. I encountered a genre of media known as boys love, which is a genre of comics that are incredibly kind of homoerotic, and we can talk about that a little bit more perhaps, but it was something that I encountered when I was making sense of my own sexual identity and my own gender identity. And as I kind of transitioned into my university life and began studying Japanese language, Japanese culture, society, what have you, as I began really thinking about taking the plunge into this crazy world of academia, that formative experience for me, that idea of encountering a kind of wellspring of knowledge in the media of Japan to inform my own sexuality, I began thinking about, well, if that was something that I experienced as a someone living outside of Japan, clearly that is something that is immensely important for young gay men in Japan making sense of their own lives. And I became interested in trying to work out what that was. Now, you mentioned that I initially began thinking through these things sociolinguistically, and that's because I was studying at Monash University, which had a long tradition of kind of very sophisticated sociolinguistic and applied linguistic research, and I was working with the team there, and I began looking at dating sites, so Japanese gay dating sites, and looking at representations of gender on those dating sites. How do people put together profiles to attract partners, and looking at the discourses of desire in order to make sense of how desire functioned. And that was quite an interesting project. And that kind of project does see itself in this book. It was in the kind of latter pages of the book, like that very initial project that I worked on is there. But when I began doing my PhD and kind of began thinking more broadly around these questions of this motivating question of like, how do people use media to make sense of their gender and sexuality and so forth, it became apparent to me that just looking at the discursive level, just analyzing the media itself wasn't answering that fundamental question that I wanted to answer, which was not what are the representational politics of these media, but how do the representational politics of these media directly impact individuals' lives? And that led me to realize, well, I can't just study these texts outside of a context. I need to think about them within the context of consumption. So whilst the book, of course, does do a lot of this representational analysis, and that's why I consider myself a cultural anthropologist, because I'm very firmly influenced by the traditions of cultural studies. But at the same time, I think of media as a material culture, an artifact that people draw upon and use as tools to make sense of the world. And the only way I felt that I could properly look at that was through ethnographic research, through field work, through interview, through working together with the community. And that's what led me to pivot away from the sociolinguistic and move more towards the anthropological. And I think that opened up insights, and by working together with people who are actively consuming the media, it actually made me realize that I was missing the big picture. I was missing the kind of broader, what I would almost say, the problems, like rather than the emancipatory potentials of the media that I was examining.
Well, that word emancipatory is really interesting, I think, because one of the sites that you went to is Shinjuku Nichome, which is broadly known as the Tokyo's gay district. And historically, it's sort of been presented as sort of an emancipatory space. But while your book doesn't say it's completely not, it does massively intervene with that kind of image of this place as a positive place for exploring and a place that is really freeing. Can you talk about how you sort of came to the realization that you were going to have to intervene with that narrative, and what interventions you found that you think are really important?
Yeah, so I think I went rather naively into the field, assuming that, like many young people, because, I was conducting this research as a young queer person myself, studying young queer people. So I went in kind of naively expecting that all of the literature, as you mentioned, and as I discuss in the book, that has previously been published on Shinjuku Nichome, for various politically important reasons, have very strongly emphasized how Nichome operates as a space of emancipation within the broader context of Japan's heteronormative society, and as a society in which it is very difficult to live as a marginalized person, particularly if your sexuality or your gender identity does not align with the hegemonic norms, right? And there's a wealth of traditions, both scholarly, activist, and even popular media, that positions Shinjuku Nichome, this nightlife district, which emerged in the late 60s, as this space of safety and community for gay men. And I don't want to say that it's not, because of course it's not. Of course it is, sorry.
Yes.
Of course it is. Of course it's an important queer space, and within the broader context of a heteronormative cityscape like Tokyo, yeah, it's important. That there's a community that supports people whose genders and sexualities deviate from the so-called mainstream norms. But when I visited Nichome and started working with the people that I was working with, so interviewing young men, I interviewed approximately 50 over the kind of various trips. I've been to Nichome and conducted fieldwork several times over a period of 5 years, and was kind of talking to them. On the surface, when you have your initial conversation with these men, they talk to you about how important Nichome is as a space to kind of get away and meet men for community, friendship, sex, romance, what have you. But the more that I met with these people and the more I spoke with them, I began to kind of get this kind of, in Japanese we have the word iwakan, a feeling of uneasiness, or a feeling of there was something wrong, or something that people weren't saying to me. And as I began learning how Nichome worked, it is this space in which there's almost, estimates say there's about 300 gay bars, which is a huge number, but most of them are very small, maximum capacity of 5 or 6 people. So space is really at a premium, and that means that the businesses are really kind of motivated to make sure they have their very specific niche clientele and then cater to that specific niche clientele. And this has led to these structures, or what I call regimes of desire, in which particular identities and particular desires become kind of normalized within the space. And people who deviate from that, in whether you desire in a different way or you're the object of a different desire, kind of leaves you outside of Nichome's mainstream. So what I increasingly learned through talking with young gay men who were, oh, I'm not good looking enough, or no one's interested in me, or why am I always getting, treated so badly, or refused service in these kind of clubs and businesses and so forth, made me realize, hang on, this place has this unacknowledged kind of set of rules that privileges some people and disadvantages others. And so the more I spent in Nichome, the more I spent working with young gay men who sat outside of the privileged set, the more I realized that, hang on, Nichome isn't necessarily a utopia for everyone. And this is really important because one thing that was often said to me is there's this phrase, very evocative, that you see in the literature that was said to me in fieldwork, is that there is no rubbish thrown away in Nichome. Nichome ni steru gomi nashi. And they say this because the idea is that everyone has their own space in Nichome. Everyone is accepted in some way, shape, or form. But I kept on meeting people who were quote unquote rubbish. Like I kept on meeting people who were being thrown away. So the idea that Nichome was some kind of utopic space that accepted everyone, yes, it's a queer space that supports, you know, same-sex desire and identity more broadly, but within that context, only certain kinds of identities and certain kinds of performances of gay identity or masculinity were acceptable. And that's what really led me to write the book that I wrote, like my dissatisfaction and in fact my concern over this policing of desire in a space that positions itself as emancipatory and open and accepting to everyone.
Well, that brings actually to an important concept that runs throughout this book, is even all the way to the very, very conclusion, is this idea of typing, or that there are certain types. You mentioned bars that only accept certain types, certain types of people that don't feel welcome. And on paper, of course, typing just sounds like putting people into categories. And it's something that you find on like you have a chapter on the dating apps that you can choose like what type you are and what type you're looking for. But you eventually conclude that there's more going on here, and that this entire process of typing affects not only the ways people conceptualize their interests verbally, but has kind of a hegemonic control over the entire regimes of desire in the space. Yeah. Can you go a bit more into this phenomenon of typing and like how you eventually led to these conclusions about it?
Yeah, so typing had been something that many people wrote about in previous scholarship, and it's certainly something that we all knew about. Like in Shinjuku Nichome, there's this kind of gay slang system that we call typing, or taipu in Japanese, and that, you know, where people would kind of like, oh, I'm this type, or I like that type, and that is not exactly kind of revolutionary in many ways. Like, not only is that common to kind of gay culture in a variety of different national settings, but actually in Japan, this concept of typing is a very frequently used kind of strategy of segmenting markets, for example, in advertising and you know, talking about, you know, this is my type. It's not exclusive to the space. But what I really learned through interviewing these gay men that I was interviewing was that they put so much stock into this notion of typing. So you mentioned the dating sites, and I think that this is a really useful kind of opportunity to think about it, because I mentioned that I did analysis of the language used on a dating site, which was actually a bulletin board system. So, you know, we're not talking about like Grindr, though I did work on location-based dating apps as well, but where people actually had to very consciously write up their identities and kind of do so in a way that was a kind of marketing. And they used typing constantly as a kind of shorthand to indicate who they were and what they liked. Likewise, we see typing in other forms of gay media in Japan. Like the kind of classification of pornographic films by type was something that was very sophisticated. As you already intimated, each bar had its type. It was a clientele that it attracted to. And as I was engaging with the space, as I was analyzing the media, despite this kind of discourse of like, oh, you know, there's a space for every type and all types are welcome, and like, you know, no matter what type you are, you'll find something in Nichome that will cater to you. I increasingly learned that, yes, okay, so superficially there's all these different types with different names and so forth, but actually, if you sit down and analyze which types are most prominent, then there was this one type which has a really complicated name in Japanese. It's called ikanimoke, which you can loosely translate as obviously gay type. And what that means is it's not like it's some kind of flaming stereotype from heteronormative culture of like some queen camp, whatever, but it's more like what the gay male culture views as being normative and the kind of the aspirational ideal, or the most desirable kind of type. And this was someone who was incredibly muscular, who was very hegemonically masculine and was participating in this kind of party boy lifestyle. Basically, you know, for those who are familiar with kind of transnational gay culture, it's the circuit gay is what we call it. Someone who's really young, kind of hyper-muscular through intense gym training, very handsome and pretty, what have you. And of course, this was the type that was most privileged. And then other types, for example, what we would call kawaii-ke, the cute type, also known as janizu-ke, so which refers to their similarity in appearance to male celebrities from an agency called Johnny's and Associates, who I have occasionally been working with over the past year. And basically, like, yes, there was this kind of narrative of like sometimes they're desirable in certain contexts, but broadly speaking, they were positioned as somehow less desirable than the ikarimo-ke. And then you had other categories like debu-ke, which is like chubby type, bears, in other words, and they were even lower. And what basically emerged for me as I was doing analysis was that, okay, so there is a hierarchy. And throughout this hierarchy, there are rules about why are certain things considered desirable and why isn't it considered desirable. And a lot of that was tied to knowledge around gender and masculinity in particular. And what really shocked me was how Japan's gay culture was resuscitating extraordinarily conservative understandings of masculinity in Japan that mainstream society, in particular young women's kind of popular culture, such as manga, dramas, idol culture, what have you, had completely, you know, thrown away. And that was really kind of interesting to me. So when I talk about regimes of desire and typing, I think of typing not just as a category system, not just as a way of kind of saying, vocalizing your desires, but it was an ideological system, or what I call in the book an affective economy. So there is a political economy to typing, but there was also an affective economy, an economy based around feelings, and that affective economy was tied into the material economy of the space, because typing was principally a way of advertising and marketing. So all of that kind of basically came together, and my principal argument in this book is that Shinjuku Nichome and the Japanese gay media landscape, in the creation of this affective economy, which sits certain desires as natural and certain other desires as unnatural, and the kind of natural desire is a desire for conservative hegemonic masculinity, it actually serves to produce anxieties about failing to live up to these aspirational ideals that basically induce young gay men to consume. And in so doing, it continues the business of Shinjuku Nichome, because as long as the media landscape and the bar culture is no longer emancipatory, as long as it injects anxieties over whether or not you're hot or not, basically, it creates this self-fulfilling prophecy, this continuing cycle of, I will never be desirable unless I continually participate in this party boy lifestyle. And that is the exact opposite of what a queer space should be. And that's what I was concerned about. So this is what I think of typing. It's ideology as much as it is categorization.
Well, there were also cases where you noted that it was just even limitation, it created limitations in even the conceptualization, right? Because when people, for instance, would first go to Nichome, they would encounter magazines, et cetera, that had these types. So they could say, okay, this is what I'm into. But you found, can you go into some cases where you found that actually people were unable to describe desires that didn't fit within the terms that they had used?
Yeah, so that was what was really interesting to me. As I was interviewing men about their understandings of typing, and I would often say to them, this is a thought experiment. Can you describe your ideal kind of partner without relying on this vocabulary that you've learned through Japan's gay media? And they would often say, no, I can't. Even though I'm saying to you the words without using the words typing, in my brain, they're still there. And I'm just trying to find ways to describe these categories. So it's almost like a form of colonization. Like it was such a pervasive form of ideology that it had forced people to conceptualize their desires in particular ways. And what really, as I said, concerned me, and what led me to write this book, which is, you know, in terms of classic queer theory, this is what we would call a paranoid reading rather than a reparative one. And like a lot of my subsequent research to kind of make up for the fact that I was so paranoid and kind of, you know, engaging with the hermeneutic, like this, the hermeneutics of skepticism and so forth, was that I'm now very reparative, but this book is not, except for the end, where I try and make sense of how there is something that kind of pushes back against all of this doom and gloom. And as much as I believe to this day that the regimes of desire still maintain effect, hopefulness and explicit engagement with political activism is the way to kind of break the regime and the ideological system. And my informants, especially some of my principal informants, began to do that. But yeah, it was such a pervasive way of thinking. And what, you know, I think the anthropological or the ethnographic method really helped me understand was that through engaging with the community and learning typing, I became inculcated into this way of thinking too, to the point where my own brain was colonized by typing. And I used that, for example, in some of the analysis where I was reading the covers of DVDs and magazines and analyzing the models appearing within them. And I could say, oh, they're this type, they're that type, purely because I'd learnt which, you know, what kinds of body types, what kinds of kind of facial features, what kinds of hair, like the symbols of these types. And I was able, through working with the community and being in the space, to learn that way of thinking. And I think that's why I became very concerned about it all, because I'd seen it causing harm to people, but I was also experiencing my own kind of ideological kind of brainwashing. And one of my informants did actually refer to this as brainwashing. They're like, we're being brainwashed.
And speaking of informants, obviously you said you talked to many people, but 4 of these stories make up really the big meat of the book, following not only just a single long interview, but actually how their thoughts and actions and behaviors have changed over, in some cases, years, as they lived in Japan and visited Nichome. And in one case that I want to talk about specifically and later, stopped going and stopped engaging. But when you were working with these respondents specifically, can you just tell us some events that happened that kind of shocked you or thought, oh, okay, what I'm doing here is really going to intervene. This is not something I expected to hear. This is not something I expect someone to say. This is new.
So I think that the opening pages of the book are where I narrate the biggest moment, which is, you know, fairly common practice, right? You know, you're creating an interesting little dialogue. So I was with one of my very first informants, who actually then became one of my principal informants. His name, well, his pseudonymous name is Shotaro. And we had just been out at a club partying, as you do. Not that I do that anymore, of course, because I'm an old man now. But we had just gone out, and then we went to, there are these places in Nichome called gay shopper, which are basically these stores, gay shops, that sell all sorts of things, principally pornography. Like, they're about selling porn and gay magazines, but they sell all sorts of things as well, bric-a-brac. And we were kind of flicking through the magazines, and Shotaro kind of pulled one of the magazines out, and he did something that many people asked me during my field work over the years that I got so sick of answering, which is like, is this guy your type, or what's your type? And he showed me a magazine that was featuring who was at the time in 2013, I have to think, 2013, the most popular gay porn star in Japan. His name was Ko Masaki, and he'd actually recently passed away when we were doing this kind of ethnographic moment. And he basically showed me this hyper muscular dude, and he's kind of like, oh, he's so manly, like, and because he's openly gay, he's Japan's first openly gay male porn star. And this is gay porn, as I learned through my research, predominantly in Japan, does that kind of weird straight fetish thing. So all the actors are quote unquote straight. Are they really? We don't know. But Masaki Komasaki, sorry, was famous for the fact that he identified as a gay man and was like hyper masculine in so doing. And Shotaro kept on saying to me, oh, you know, he's so manly. Like, you look at this and you compare it to these really kind of hyper camp femme queen characters you see on Japanese variety shows, and it's really proof that, you know, gay men can be masculine and that we shouldn't be so like, you know, we can push back against these negative stereotypes that exist in mainstream media. And, you know, usually that's where, up until the scholarship, this has been the narrative. Gay media empowers Japanese gay men to push back against their disenfranchisement and negative portrayals in mainstream media. So that's great. But then Shotaro kind of had this moment where he became quite pensive and quite, what I actually thought, he seemed visibly upset. And so I was actually kind of concerned. I'm like, you know, I was getting decent rapport with him. I still have good rapport with him. We're still friends to this day. And he's like, I'm like, what's wrong? You know, you've just told me this amazing story about how gay men can be masculine. You know, this is great. But what I learned, like looking back on that moment now, is like, this is when the regimes of desire began to impact this guy hardcore, because Shotaro was not some hyper buff ikanimoke type who, you know, he was relatively thin, shorter, had a big complex about the fact that a lot of people thought that he was, you know, too cute and effeminate. And like he kept on saying to me, you know, I can be manly like this. I need to become more straight acting. He kept on telling me like he needed to change himself to become like this man. And I basically realized that, hang on, you've just told me how emancipatory this is. And now you're spiraling into this kind of negative feeling. And you keep on talking to me about how you want to be straight acting and you want to be more manly. And that was really concerning to me. And that was the moment very early in my fieldwork, I think it was about 2 to 3 weeks in, where something clicked and I'm kind of like, hang on, this stuff is causing harm. And that's what really then led me to every subsequent interview that I had. And as I got to know other key informants, the other 3 men who became my key informants, that's when I realized that I needed to find out more about this. I use the word harm, and maybe it sounds like I'm being too over-exaggerated there, but like there was an informant of mine named Haruma who had serious harm, serious psychological harm, caused by his consumption of media. And also a shitty boyfriend. Yeah.
Well, those 2 stories actually I want to ask about specifically because I think they're 2 of the really most impactful ones, because both of those respondents ended up by the end of your study drastically changing their relationship with Nichome and with Japanese gay media. Can you talk a bit about kind of these transformations and what happened? You know, not to spoil everything here, but what sort of, you know, led to them eventually, in one case, just abandoning media in almost entirely, correct?
Yeah. Yes and no. So to Shotaro, and I won't talk any more about Shotaro, but he ended up moving to like Canada, and it's like, oh yeah, Japanese gay media is crap. Japan's crap. I'm going to go and I'm going to leave. And then he goes and gets a boyfriend in Canada. But the other informant that I mentioned there, Haruma, who he really had psychological harm, to the point where, like, ethically I asked him, like, do you want to continue participating? And he's like, yes, I want my story to be told. So he really struggled with kind of making sense of himself in the world. He identified as this kind of phenomenon in Japan known as a soushoku kei danshi, which means a herbivorous boy. So he really identified with this kind of hyper cute, somewhat effeminate kind of subculture that was tied to stereotypically feminine things in Japan. And he was like the quintessential, what we call in Japanese, bishonen, beautiful male youth, like very slim, very pretty. And he kind of eventually realized that quite late in life, actually, that he was gay, like that he was attracted to other men. And he eventually found himself in a relationship with another gay man who was like a quintessential ikanimoke, like quintessential top of the ideal kind of super masculine, hyper masculine kind of guy, who I give the pseudonym Akito. And Akito consistently tried to change who Haruma was always telling him, like, you know, oh, look, consume all of this media, like, look at what is attractive. You need to be like this too. You need to be more manly. Like, you're too effeminate. Like, I'm going to show you the ropes. I'm going to tell you what it means to be a gay man. And like, Haruma increasingly felt like he was losing control of himself. And then eventually Akito just broke up with him and said, look, you're not putting in the effort, you're not becoming ikanimoke, you're too femme, I can't deal with you, let's end this relationship. And Haruma had a nervous breakdown and had to return to his, he was actually originally from Kagoshima, which is quite far away from Tokyo, down in the south of Japan. And, you know, he had to leave, completely leave, and went back to his home family and kind of had this moment of introspection whilst also dealing with the psychological damage that he experienced. And he basically came to the opinion that, like, he used to say to me that the gay media of Japan is dokuyaku, it's poison. And that he completely rejected it. And then he returned to Nichome. So he never gave Nichome up. He stopped going as frequently. And he completely transformed his media habits. And he found for himself like a community of people like himself who leaned into the desirability of the kawaii care and cuteness and effeminacy, but in so doing recognized that they would always sit at the outside of the kind of mainstream of Nichome. And I think that was like, and he made his peace with that. He's like, well, why should we transform ourselves into these hulking macho types if that's not who we are? And like, he eventually, as I said, wanted to have his story told because he was like, I want to show people that this is causing harm, and like my self-esteem was shattered, and that I could only recuperate who I was by rejecting the regimes of desire. And I think that was, for me, that story of Haruma and the really difficult time that he went through. And throughout the book, I talk about his various relationships to the different types of media that I analyze and kind of narrate his journey, as well as the others. Like, there's other journeys there too. So, you know, I'm not spoiling everything, but really, it's, I think, the clearest example of how this space and this media isn't necessarily always emancipatory due to the representational politics and the effective economies that are entangled within them.
So as the last kind of big picture question, and one that I hope maybe a bit more lighthearted, one of my favorite chapters, just because it's a blast to read, is your analysis of the titles of gay pornographic films in Japan. Can you talk a little bit about why you analyze these and what you found out through this analysis, beyond the typing you mentioned earlier?
Yeah. So as I kind of mentioned to you, like I was interested in working together with gay men because I wanted to know what media they actually consumed and how often they consumed and what was most important to them. So I'm like, why should I sit down and analyze, you know, linguistically this type of media if no one actually engages with it? And through interviewing gay men about like, what is the most frequent kind of gay media you engage with on a day-to-day basis? Well, hey presto, guess what? It's porn. So of course I needed to study pornography. And I did so not through analyzing the films themselves, because not that I think it's not some prudishness around the idea that you shouldn't analyze pornography, because subsequently I have actually analyzed the films together with a colleague named Alexandra Hambleton, who works at Tsuda University in Japan. We've got a few things coming out on porn in Japan, but I was most interested in looking at the covers, so the ways in which porn companies package and promote and market films. And this is principally because I learned that visiting these, as I said, these gay shops, gay shopper, and kind of browsing through porn DVDs was a bit of a social phenomenon that was occurring when I was initially there in 2013. But as the world became increasingly more digital, that kind of became less of a thing. But yeah, so I started looking at the porn DVDs, and I became really interested in, as I said, the ways in which porn in Japanese gay porn would promote this narrative of the desirability of straight men, and then suggest that straight men were somehow equivalent to the ikanimoke, which I will remind everyone literally means obviously gay men. So to be an obviously gay man in Japan, you needed to be somehow akin or similar to a straight man. And that contradiction was so confusing to me that I just had to unravel it. So I spent a lot of time kind of analyzing the representational strategies on porn covers, and as you mentioned, the titles of the films. And like I was particularly interested in like saying, how do they kind of justify the focus on straight men in an environment where, you know, the ideal desirability like is around ostensibly gay men, right? And there's these three broad kind of major discourses that I uncovered. So one is this idea that so of course I never talk about the financial motives of the performers, or the fact that the performers may not actually be straight. That's the other thing we don't know. But the three categories I'm going to need to check. So the first is to kind of emphasize something that is very common in porn in Japan more broadly, is known as hatsutaiken, so the first experience. So kind of emphasizing that it's their first time and emphasizing their virginity. The second one was particularly concerning to me. There was at least a third of the corpus, and I analyzed 810 films that emphasize some kind of forced act or rape. And then eroticized the raping of straight men and the transformation of them into objects for gay male consumption. And then the last one was a discourse of surprise, and it's actually quite hard to explain. So I'm going to just kind of give you an example of one of the titles in translation. This is, I think, one of Wes's favorites. So this is it's not actually the title, it's some ad copy. So it's quote, "Even though he can only fuck women, why is it that he came in a man's ass?" And that was written there, like, and then you've got this
question.
Yeah, and it is a question. But the thing is, and it's an interesting question. And as I was kind of interviewing kind of people around their porn consumption and looking at the kind of typing of porn, where basically everyone was this kind of hyper masculine representation, and basically I learnt through my analysis of porn and my conversations with my informants, both my principal informants as well as the broader kind of collective of men that I was interviewing over the years, that there is this kind of idea that straight acting is code for a particular kind of body. This is the hyper masculine body of the ikanimoke, and basically straight acting is just a code word for like normative masculinity. And this is made clearer in comparison to the films that are targeting, once again, this kind of more cuter aesthetic. And I can't remember the exact figures, though I could, once again, I can check. But if you look at the percentage of films that identify as like hyper masculine, like it's something like, 68% were this hyper masculine, and then 30%-ish were cute. So I think that kind of talks about there's this dichotomy.
So as we kind of move to the end here, there's two questions I want to ask you kind of post-book.
Yes.
Because this book, actually, you were finished. I saw you writing the final drafts when I first came to Macquarie. And due to, COVID and everything, it's been a bit of a delay getting out. So it's been a while since you, put the kind of the ink to dry, if you will. If you were to look back on this book now, given all the research you've done since then, is there anything you've come across that kind of makes you rethink some of the conclusions that you came to here? Is there any way that you've seen your own thinking changing as you've looked at other phenomenon that are related, or more phenomena that are similar to what's in this book?
It's a difficult question, because my research has moved very much away from Japan in recent years. But I think that my final chapter was quite emancipatory, right? I was trying to read very positively, trying to say, here are the strategies that people have developed to push back against these regimes of desire, and how they're embracing hopefulness as an opportunity to kind of develop a new kind of politics. But then the pandemic happened. And the pandemic really frustrated some of the momentum, like I was observing in 2018, 2019, as I was wrapping up the first draft. So I finished writing the first draft of this in 2018, which is a long time ago now. And I think that I actually recently presented at the Association of Asian Studies it was in Hawaii, but of course I did so virtually, where I was trying to make sense of like how can I, like I looked back at the hopefulness and the predictions that I made that, activism and and this kind of turn towards LGBTQ rights and a broader mainstream awareness of these things and a kind of political commitment on behalf of certain local governments to fix these problems might lead to a more emancipatory future. And then COVID happened, and I don't think that emancipatory future, I think that the hopes that I was so invested in exploring maybe didn't happen. So I kind of say to people who now approach me around this book that we need people to kind of move forward. Like, I conducted this fieldwork in 2013 through to 2017, right? And things change, and I wonder if the regimes of desire are being dislodged or if they transformed into something new. And that, I guess, you know, from just looking at what's happening in Japan right now, I don't think things have changed. Like, I know that the question that you've asked me is like, you know, maybe trying to push me to re-theorize or something, but it's the opposite. Like, I kind of stand by the arguments. I don't think things have changed.
And then just finally, you know, anyone who knows your prodigious research output should not be surprised that we began this book talk by announcing that you'll probably be back here for a book talk again soon. So can you just give us a little hint on what you've been working on and what's this new book going to be?
So this book has I mentioned at the start of this that my research into Japanese gay media was motivated by my discovery of boys' love, which is a genre of comics and other related media in Japan that focuses on the kind of relationships between these beautiful male youths known as bishonen that are primarily written for and by heterosexual women, though a very small part of this book argues about how gay men engage with it and use it as a way to push back against the regimes of desire, like, because it is counter to the regimes of desire. Now, my recent research has been very interested in how boys' love transnationalizes and how people from various LGBTQ community groups across East and Southeast Asia have drawn upon boys' love as a site to kind of make sense of their gender and sexuality, you know, in their own local context. And I've been doing a lot of work on Thailand in particular, where there's been this huge explosion of boys' love media. And this is what my next book is all about, which is scheduled to come out either late this year or early next. And like, what I think I mentioned to you that this book is very paranoid. So I've moved to being reparative. So my questioning is not like, you know, how are hopes being frustrated, or how is like commercial or capitalist neoliberal media kind of stymieing development of identity. Like, my work in Thailand has been asking the exact opposite question. It's like, how has the kind of emergence of a highly capitalist form of media known as boys' love actually led to this kind of emancipatory, hopeful feeling around the kind of futures for same-sex desiring people. And that's really kind of where my work has been going. But in recent years, I've become increasingly, once again, I've become more and more interested in idol culture. And some people who've been following me on Twitter may know that recently I've also been going even darker than where this book goes by thinking about the works of the Japanese novelist / right-wing fanatic / failed coup leader Mishima Yukio. And he's in this book too in a minor way. So I'm kind of at the moment trying to juggle, like, asking these questions around, like, okay, so women's media in Japan is extraordinarily kind of queer and feminist in some regards. I want to think about that, but at the same time, how can I address this without addressing the question of Mishima? And for some people, they're like, that doesn't make sense. But I'm trying to make it make sense. So I don't know. Well,
that gives us a lot to look forward to reading.
Yeah.
God. Thank you very much for all your time answering these questions, Tom. Thank you.
I hope that I answered them well enough.
And any questions you didn't answer, you can find out by reading Regimes of Desire.
Yes.
Before we let Tom go, are there any questions? We've got a few minutes left. I know everyone has some sort of sort of, as we head into week 13, has some deadlines and some things to do. So we will try and wrap it up on the hour. But in the meantime, does anybody have any questions in the room for Tom or online? We have the capacity to hear our Zoomers live. So Consuelo, can you unmute yourself?
Sorry.
That's the way. Yeah, we can hear you.
Great work, Tom. So I found it incredibly interesting. I always have questions for you, so I can always ask. I think you've touched on a lot of what interests me personally, especially the whole way in which this connects with international discussions around masculinity. So I don't know if this is what you're exploring in your next project.
I think that, I mean, one of the things that I've been doing in my career post writing this book is exploring how these media travel and what happens when they travel. So I've done a lot of work, for instance, in the Philippines. I've done, in 2019, I was interviewing a lot of Filipinos who were consuming Japanese gay porn or consuming the gay male comics that form a part of this particular narrative. And what really interested me was how they kind of skipped over or completely ignored all of these kind of elements that I was talking about today and put it into dialogue with local concerns. And for them, it was emancipatory because they live in such a heteronormative society that they needed something foreign to make sense of it. I have also been toying with thinking about what happens when this kind of media moves into a society such as Australia, which kind of sits on the borders between Asia and the term I don't like, but I'll use it, the West. And that is something that I'm interested in. But as I think that some of my questions nowadays are moving more away from questions of gender and more towards questions of sexuality. And I don't mean to create some kind of sex gender cut, but I've become less interested in questions of gender representation or gender performativity. But yeah, I don't know how satisfying that response is, Consuelo. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Tom.
A couple of questions. So absolutely loved it, Tom. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah. Yes,
okay.
we're getting nods.
So just a few questions, I guess. I think a lot of what you said really resonated with me in terms of gay and lesbian history in Sydney, Melbourne, right? And I think that the pattern that you describe is quite common, where a marginalized group forms its own subculture, which then contains exclusions within it. And I think in the 80s and 90s, there was quite a bit of stuff coming out from queer Asians, which dealt with racialized regimes of desire. So I think like that probably is quite a normal pattern, don't you think? Yeah. In terms of marginalized cultures consolidating some kind of community identity for themselves. So that's just one point. Another point I thought was really interesting was, I guess, as you were talking about, the typing and all of that, of course, I thought about romance, right? And it seems to me that the desires, the regimes of desires are actually regimes of fantasies. And these fantasies are discourses. They're mini, microfictions that consumers are telling themselves about the types of bodies that they like. The types of bodies are related to the kinds of stories or scenarios in which sexual desire is enacted. So that was another thing. But I think, coming back to the romance market and the mainstream, I wonder whether you can comment on what happened when all of this became digital. Because of course, in the romance market, what happened with the digital revolution in publishing and social media was that all of these, niche groups found different ways of articulating niche desires, niche stories, and challenged and took on mainstream media, mainstream publishing, which then had to respond to them. So that this was the operation of the market in terms of, they became successful online, and then they forced mainstream media to change. So I'm wondering whether that happened in the communities you're talking about. I'm sorry, there's a lot of things, but it's a really interesting thing. Final question comes back to your right-wing person, because as you were talking about these hyper-masculinized bodies and all of that, it really made me think about the hyper-masculinity and the fascist body. So I'm wondering whether you didn't address, like political ideologies, whether that was explored in the book. Sorry, lots and lots of questions there.
So I won't address the comments, though I agree with you. To talk about the digitalization, what was actually most interesting to me in the chapter on dating sites was that I found that basically, yes, they all of my informants were turning to dating sites as a way to kind of break free from the regimes of desire. But what I think is the important element of studying these things in context, like in a space like Shinjuku Nichome, where particular ways of understanding media or particular ways of reading media, if I want to extend that fiction metaphor, have become normative. What eventually happens, and what I learned, and I'll cover this very briefly because I'm aware of time, is that basically the media, like the dating sites, the dating apps and the dating sites became typed. So basically, if you didn't ascribe to the type that the community assumed was attached to that particular dating app, and some of these were racialized, I should mention, as much as they were gendered, then you were considered to be inauthentic and hence unable to secure a successful date. So what became interesting to me was how my informants, especially my 4 principal kind of key interlocutors, turned to dating sites to try and break free from the regimes of desire. And then when they found out that they were still trapped in the regime of desire, it was their experiences with dating sites that led to their most kind of the moment of, I actually theorize it as interpellation. So they became aware of themselves. They were hailed, to quote Althusser, by the ideological system in which they were situated. And actually, I haven't spoken about him, but one of my key interlocutors, his name was Yoichi, and he was an ikanimoke. He was super popular. He was like an influencer before influencers were a thing. And like he was super popular, but then he suddenly decided that, like, okay, I'm sick of messing around casually and kind of just being some hot guy that hangs out with people. I want to have a real relationship, and started trying to develop romantic relationships. And suddenly on dating sites, it's like, oh, well, you're just some ikanimoke party boy. We don't want to like have anything to do with you. And then he realized his own, even though he was privileged, like his privileging was no longer a privilege, and it led to a radical break, to the point where his radical break actually meant that I never met him again after my initial period of fieldwork, because he just cut himself off so radically, because he realized just how pervasive all of this was. And another one of my interlocutors, so Shotaro, tried to position himself as someone who has no type, and he called himself Datsu Taipu, I'm against typing. And it's like, okay, that was how he tried to get away from all of this. But in refusing to play the game, he wasn't able to communicate with these people who had become quote unquote brainwashed to think in this way. And that's what eventually led him to leave Japan and move to Canada. And so, like, there is, I think, once again, there's a kind of narrative that, okay, digital media will save us. It will fix these problems. It's a space of freedom and so forth. But it wasn't. Like, and that was another one of the big kind of findings. And as I mentioned to you very briefly, this was also racialized. And I have also written about xenophobia in this space as well.
All right. Well, I think the clock is actually going to beat us. Could we all put our hands together, our virtual hands or our real hands, and thank Wes and particularly Dr. Tom Baudinette. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us today in the real space, which is great, and of course online. Our next, I'm just looking at the schedule here, our next book seminar will take place on the 22nd of June, and that's with Dr. Daniel Johnson, and we'll make sure that we email and communicate the details about that in the coming weeks. So thank you all online, and thank you all in 187. Thank you.
Thank you.
See everybody.
Thank you, Andrew.